As you know, I think Michael Gove announced in the 25-year plan earlier this year that there will be a review into designated landscapes, and in May he asked me to lead it, which is a great honour. I should say briefly, I'm not responsible for DEFRA policy. I'm not of DEFRA. I'm an independent reviewer. I'm a journalist in my other life. I have worked in government as well. So I'm coming to this as somebody who cares about landscapes, who knows many of the places, knows many of the areas of outstanding natural beauty, which I'll get right. I got it wrong in a letter I sent to Colette down in Cornwall the other day, so I will put the O in the right place this time. And I really think we've got an extraordinary opportunity now through the review and through wider government policy and the energy you're showing today and in the conference you're doing and in the public love and interest in our landscapes to do things differently and better. So I was very clear at the start, starting the review, and it's clear in the terms of reference. This isn't a retreat or some shrinking of protection or a sort of economic review of what opportunities there are for exploitation. This is a serious piece of work to take something which we're very proud of in our country, which has worked well for nearly 70 years, and which is hugely loved and visited, as you know, by people across England, and to make it stronger. So we're approaching this. I'm working with Louise here, and she is the person who you need to pour thoughts into as much as me, who started now 2.5 weeks ago, just over 2 weeks ago. Feels like we've already been to lots of places. We're working with Louise and Dan, you know, as well, and other people in DEFRA, and the panel of reviewers that we have. None of them are here today, but I'm going to be travelling a bit with them. They're going off occasionally on their own to see things, and we'll be meeting regularly once we get our diaries in order. We're already having lots of email discussions of the opportunities. So if you meet and you know people on the panel, Fiona and Jim Dixon and many other people, talk to them too. They're just as central to what we're doing. And then the timing will be, we're doing lots of visits in the summer, and apologies if we don't get to everywhere we'd like to go, and we'll try and do some more in the spring. But we'll do visits in the summer, we're doing meetings now, we've met some of you already. We'll be doing a call for evidence, so I have to say it's call for evidence, not a consultation, because apparently that involves writing around every government department and nothing ever happens. A call for evidence in the autumn, running probably up to Christmas, probably just after Christmas. We'll give you long enough to respond to it if you want to respond. We'll try and keep it simple. We want interesting ideas. There isn't a prize for length. It's going to be an attempt to give people a fair opportunity of all sides to put views in. We'll draw on that. We'll draw on the conversations and trips we're having now and the thoughts of the panel, and no doubt other research we'll want to commission early in the new year to write the report with the aim of it coming out in September next year. So it's a rapid process, but I hope a long enough process that there's time to think seriously and think ambitiously. I'll just say a couple of things. One is everybody would like more funding, and you can understand how much more you could do with more funding, and we need to think about how we can best make that happen. I have to say I think it's unlikely that if the report just said to the Treasury, please double the funding, the Treasury would do it. So we need to work together on funding. And I don't want to just have ambitions that can't happen because there is no money. There's no point in doing that. But I think there are ways we can work forward. We need to think about the designation process. It isn't a review just into designation. Natural England have got a role in that, but maybe we can do things more quickly or flexibly. Again, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. We need to think about the future of farming, of course, as that changes. And I know there's a lot of interesting work being done, both in DEFRA and beyond, on that policy area. And whilst there's a lot of uncertainty, I do think we should draw some excitement from it, and Brexit has mixed views, but one of the exciting things is the opportunity to think ahead, look at the CAP, see what might change, and try and fight for the best things for designated landscapes. And I think the opportunity there is really quite big. And I think it's exciting to see DEFRA doing work on broad aims of government policy, focusing on good public outcomes, in a way that I think many other sectors in the economy would beg for. If you ask the car industry, what idea does the government have of its future in a few years' time, I think right now they'd find that hard to answer. So perhaps we ought to be quite proud that with the environment and with landscapes, people are leading the way, thinking ahead, rather than being in the side stream of government. And that's an unusual and exciting moment. It's part of why the review's here. It's not the only aspect of it. There'll be plenty of other bits of government working on things too, and non-government organisations too. But enough really from me. I'm happy to answer a few questions, but the core thing is I want to hear what you've got to say, so I'll let Howard perhaps chair a bit of a discussion. I'll chip in maybe if there are things to join in. But tell me what you think, tell me what you'd like to see from the review. And finally, I would say I'm very clear that this isn't a review into national parks only. And I know it will get picked up if it gets picked up at all in the media as the National Parks Review. It did a bit at its launch. It's not just that. I'm really clear about that. The first visit we did was to Cornwall, not to a national park, even though I live in the Peak District, very much national park. I'm aware of the great landscapes around, some of them designated now, some wanting designation. I know Shropshire very well. I grew up partly in the Shropshire Hills, and I still would say that they are as beautiful as anywhere in a national park. Many of your landscapes are, and they need as much love and attention. So this isn't a National Parks Review, it's a designated landscape review. And over to Howard and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether...
Try that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Julian. Before I open it up, what I wanted to do is just give you a couple of minutes of insight into the sort of discussions that we've had, both as a collective, AONB lead officers, and an insight to the discussion that trustees of the National Association have had. We did have the pleasure of meeting Julian and Lou very early on in the process, and I think that was very, very well received. But just to reiterate the context, this is a positive review. When the central questions are what might be done better, what changes might assist you, and are the definitions and systems still sufficient for the challenges that you face? It's clearly a very positive review, and there have been many reviews of many different things in the past that have been less so. So it's a positive review. It will report to government, not just DEFRA, and that's a really, really important fact. Its implementation will be led by the Secretary of State, and probably one of the most active Secretary of States we've ever come across. So there is a potential there for some longer term thinking, but also, I suspect, some quite short term, some quite quick, rapid wins. And I think really importantly, the review will report in the year of the 70th anniversary of the 1949 Act. I mean, it will be a celebratory year. So the review will sit within that whole, that year of celebration. Interestingly, it's also a spending review. There's a spending review taking place in the early part of that year. So there's a lot of things that are going to align at the same time, and I think it's incumbent upon us to make this a successful review, not just for Julian, but for all of us. So that was really my preamble to the context. I won't repeat the relationship between this and the 25-year plan. That's been covered already today. But what I will say is that the conversations we've had with lead officers, and we have gone out to all of the lead officers in advance, and I just pick up on some of the points. It's a real desire to strengthen the designation, whatever that looks like. Greater weight to management plans, that's come out in discussions earlier on today. The real thorny debate around influencing planning and how we might be better at that and do that. What about strategic development, development plans for these areas, and how do we instigate a system where such a thing exists? Statutory consultee status, that came up today and it's come up in conversations a lot. Section 85, the duty of regard, you know, we've been wrestling with this, many of us, for decades. What is now the time to really get to grips with that? Is that something that we want to look at? Stable and adequate multi-year funding. Now, we hear what Julian says, but the bottom line is, when I speak to Colette in Cornwall, and after that, you know, after her fixed costs have been taken out of the equation, she has 50,000 to spend on all the good stuff that you hear about, and that's not, you know, that's not a one-off case. So we can't forget that, but it is very much part of the mix. Simplified boundary reviews, flexible governance, appetite for broadening the role, particularly in relation to any environmental land management scheme. So that's the sort of flavour of discussion we've had with lead officers. The flavour, just to give you the flavour of the discussion we've had with trustees of the National Association, and they're all comfortable, they all sit comfortably alongside the others. Could we collaborate better? Could we be more could we really start to integrate issues? And one of the earlier conversations about rural payments, one of the discussions we've had is, what's the funding base for these areas? Where is this funding coming from? How are we strategically directing it, rather than looking at each individual funding stream in a separate way? Could we not do something a little bit more strategic? How do we report on the impact of delivery? As a national association, we're desperate to tell the story, but could we not report better on the impact? And how do we act as wider advocates for landscape in general, beyond the designated landscapes? Targeted land management support, we've talked about. Duty of regard has come up with trustees. Standards, performance, how do we optimise that? How do we demonstrate public interest delivery rather than focus on titles and labels, which is what could have done in the past? How do we improve the quality of and the access to designated landscapes? And then the planning function, how do we improve that planning function? So that's a lightning tour of the sort of discussions that are going on nationally. We will pull together evidence on behalf of you all, and that will obviously sit with your individual evidence that you'll want to feed into the discussions. And we will hold a lead officers meeting in September where we're going to bring you all together to give you the opportunity to start forming your thinking again around where the review is going and what you want out of it. So I'm going to say nothing more than that, other than to open the floor up. As Julian said, he might intervene, he might comment, but he's not here to sit here and be pummeled with questions from the audience.
Good.
So I've given him my assurance that won't happen. So it would be good to hear your best thinking. It would be good for this to be a discussion amongst ourselves, not necessarily us and you. So I open it up to the floor. Do we have somebody?
Can I just ask one really quick question
Yes.
for clarity? Does it include UNESCO designated landscapes like World Heritage Sites, biospheres?
The core of it is English designated. So I think. Sorry. I think the core answer is not specifically no. It's the traditional English designations. I mean, those do have a role, and they'd be something to take into account. And there is a requirement in terms of reference to look at how we work with other designations. Quite a broad, that alley could lead to many places. But no, and actually just to pick that up, a thing that we have to get right in this review is not to do everything or to try to do everything, because otherwise it will just become a list with paragraph 37b.4 with lots and lots of good thoughts, hopefully good thoughts, but very hard to see what you could do out of it. So there will be things that we could address in the review, we just won't be able to, either because of time, but also because to come up with something that's useful, it can't be something that does everything. That doesn't mean those designations aren't interesting or relevant, but I don't think they're central to it.
Thank you.
Could I ask, when you ask a question, you say who you are and where you're from for the benefits of the note takers as well, please. So, yeah.
I'm Alice Hannison, I'm the Vice Chair of East Devon AONB. I'm going to ask that question from another angle. In East Devon, we have the South West Coast Path, a national trail, for the Jurassic Coast, or Heritage Site, and have the AONB. We've got a review of two parts, the national parks and the AONBs. Why isn't the review for the protected landscapes? Because we're all going to have to, if you have a new system for half, how's the other half going to be able to interact with that if that's not been reviewed?
If you can hear me, yeah. Turning into question and answer. to turn it the other way, which is a good political answer to a question. To turn it the other way, I think if you can show what is gained, if you either in the call for evidence or probably not enough time now, but if you can show that there's a lot to be gained by working with other bodies, and I've talked to some of the people involved in the South West Trail already, I know how busy and successful it is. I've walked bits of it. If you can show that there is something more to be gained by trying to address something more, I think we can look at that. But what we can't do is just become a review into everything that's good that happens in the countryside. And it is a difficult balance, because of course many things will happen outside the strict areas of designated landscapes. You could easily say, and people will, what about the landscape that isn't designated? Surely we should be reviewing that too. And it's true. But my job is to do the terms of reference that have been set by the Secretary of State to try and assist the government's wider thinking. So up to a point, and I'm not trying to duck the question, but up to a point on something like trails or something else, it might be that government needs to take that into account alongside the review as much as the review needs to encompass everything.
Lucy, if you could explain who you are and where you're from.
Yes, my name's Lucy Galvin. I'm from the Norfolk Coast Partnership, an AONB Norfolk Coast. Thank you very much for coming. It's really, really good you're here. And I know this is just one little element of what you'll be picking up on. One thing that struck me this morning was that we saw a lot of projects from different AONBs reporting as part of the Bowland Board. And they were doing very good, very rich projects, different stuff. But some of them quite similar, and that's replicated right across the AONBs. And we're all very special and very different, and that's fantastic, and projects grow from the ground up. But the team we have nationally working doesn't really have the resource to help enough sharing happen, in my experience. I mean, ask everyone in this room what they think, but I think there's a lot of space for a bit more resource for strategic working across AONBs together so that we can share expertise. I mean, we've got the National Association. In France, they have a team of 50 in Paris working with them.
Just on that, I'll throw it out to other people as well. Is it, and this is again a political answer, is it only resource that's a problem? I'm not denying the challenge of resource. Or is it partly a mentality as well? That people haven't seen themselves as part of a collective body, it's been very much linked to places.
Chris?
Very much not the latter,
yeah.
I'd suggest. I think we are all committed to collaborative working. The National Association has been at the forefront of encouraging us to do that. Not only are we committed, I think, to working with each other as best we can, we also work very closely with our neighbouring national park authorities where those exist. We've got lots of collaborations, especially in the north and I think in the southwest with our neighbouring national parks. It's not just an issue of resources, of course. Resources are important, and I'm not going to bang on about resources. But we do, I think, genuinely have a collective desire to collaborate, and wherever we can, we look for opportunities to do that.
Can I jump in? And I'm trying to deflect this now from being a question and answer to Julian, but what do other people think of Chris's statement around collaboration?
It is happening, and you know we had a regional coordinator in the southwest, Dave Dixon, who a lot of people in this room will know. That was originally funded through central funding. And that's, unfortunately, it's a resource that's now gone. There's a shadow, I think we've fair to say, from the southwest, please chip in, but there's a shadow of that framework still in place. It's more active in some areas around planning, and that happens, I think, nationally as well. And with the undergrounding programme that we have with Western Power, where there is much closer collaboration. But to be able to do the facilitation of engagement that we had in the southwest that was going on when we had the good old days of the RDA, the regional sort of approach to things, it worked very well, and there was a lot of sharing taking place. The resource has been taken away, and we've lost that because we've also lost capacity within our teams. All of us have had to cut staff over here. So I was just asking Tom, what do you think the average size of an AMB team is? Well, it's got to be somewhere between 4 and 6. And you listen to that long list of things that Howard's saying that everybody wants us to be able to do. We want to be AONBs but not AONBs, we want to have the O in the right place. We want to be national parks and not national parks, but we want the good things of the national parks, but not the bad things. So, you know, there's so many balls up in the air, but...
just on that, what are the bad things?
The bad things?
Yeah.
For me, I think, well, this is personal, I think some of the cultural baggage that goes with national parks is a bad thing. I think we are regarded as being very adaptive and fleet of foot and able to engage efficiently and effectively, and for the amount of investment we have, and I'd echo that figure of 50 grand, it's about the same for us, we multiply that significantly. I think we are more trusted. There is less of a... Yeah.
Can I take you back to... Sorry, can I take you... Yeah. I'll take you back to the report that we commissioned some time ago on AONB partnerships and the value of AONB partnerships. And the issue of trust, how you were trusted in the local community came out right on the top. That and the power to convene was a second. So I think there is that.
Things that I think would be nice to have, or should be explored or looked at, is the recreation side of things. And it's changed completely from when the parks were designated and what recreation was then, perceived to be, and the benefits of it, and what it is now. I would argue that probably AONBs, in terms of access for local communities, are far more well used and more significant, but it's not a duty.
Paul, you were going to come in earlier on.
Yeah.
You better say.
Paul Jackson, Hording Hills AONB. Just to come in on a few of those, echo Chris's point that there is, it's not a cultural mentality of not sharing. It's down to resources, and that echoes Chris's point. Just on that, I think I'd love to be average, because having 6 people there would treble my staff resource. 4 to 6 would double it. But this is not. It's not my thing's not about resources. I think that if I was going to sum this up in 2 words, it would be I would hope that we would get better efficiency out of this, because what we've seen today is a lot of good examples of what people have been doing. One of the things here we've talked about is just now was about knowledge sharing. the reason we don't have enough time, the reason we don't share that knowledge and post a lot of our stuff up into the National Association Library is that quite simply with 2 members of staff we do not have the time to do that because we are dealing with other things which are higher priority. Now, that's not a plea for more resources in my team, it's for it's potentially for other ways of doing things which make the best use of our time. Quite a lot of the points that Howard made there, that he ran through, things that have come out from the lead officers and from his request for information on Basecamp about, if we asked for one thing, what would it be? And a lot of mine are around better efficiency, because we have, within all the AOMB partnerships, we have a lot of variability about how people do things, and people are wrestling with different issues at different times. And there are some things that, I don't want to turn this into a comparison with a national park, because I think I'm probably right in saying that out of all AOMBs, I'm the only one that is based in the National Park office. And so we work extremely closely with it because it's very efficient for us to do so. So there are a variety of things that come up over time which are the product of how AOMB governance or finance or whatever has developed over the years. So stable finance, as you'll probably be aware, up until the last spending review, when we got 4-year protected settlement, we were living, year on year, hand to mouth. We didn't have that consistency, and that doesn't, in business, that doesn't encourage investment in the future if you don't know that you're actually going to be in existence in a year's time. So there's that element there. One of the other elements around that is the governance model with local authorities, and I'm well aware in this room that there are people who say, no, leave that alone, that's perfectly fine. Talk to other people in this room and they'll say, we spend a lot of time, we can potentially spend a lot of our time relationship building within our local authority host because there's a change of staff. Just
to pick that point up and maybe ask others as well, do you find local authorities, and it'll vary, but local authorities respect what you believe and want to do, are proud of it, see it as part of the identity of the area, or are they desperately trying to ignore you and build lots of houses?
I think that's the issue. The issue that I was raising is that very much that it's not the value of it; it's how your host authority perceives. We're this weird thing, we're employed by the host authority, but we're somehow got this semi-independent sort of status.
Can I jump in because they're. Go on, Paul.
So semi-independent status, and when you get a change of management, change of personnel at senior level, and they say, "Oh, what's this organisation? It's semi-independent." You're on this piece of elastic which is either very tight or very loose, and at a moment's notice, you can be sailing along quite fine. All of a sudden, you end up change of staff, and you have to start all over again. If we could smooth that out so that those questions didn't arise.
I fear that's called politics.
Can I jump in here?
No, it's not. It's governance. Yeah. It's not. It's governance. It used to be laid down in the memorandums of agreement that Natural England had, and we don't have those anymore.
If I can jump in, because I'm aware that we've got about 50. What I've got is Sue with a question or a statement that may relate to something earlier. We've got James and Peter on the local authority issue, and I've got Martin with his hand up over there. Sue, was your?
Both.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
my answer to the question is one about relevance.
Yeah.
And I think one of the hardest questions we've got to ask ourselves is, are we relevant to the majority of people in this country? And I mean, I say that in an AOMB, sorry, Sue Holden Chilton's AOMB, should have said, in an AOMB where I've got adjacent to us places like urban areas like Reading, Luton, High Wycombe, Aylesbury. If I went into any of those town centres and stood in the high street and asked people, nobody would know what landscape is, no one knows what an AOMB is or protected landscape, they don't even know what a national park is. And that relevance question is key, because when I, to come back to your question, Julian, go to a local authority, I am regularly having to explain who we are, what we do, what the legislation is there to do, what their duty is supposed to be.
And you've got several, haven't you,
and
to deal with?
13 now, was 15, and it's going to go down because there's lots of local government change coming. but I'm having to explain to local councils, not the ones in the AOB, of course they get it and they're very supportive and very protective, but all our local authorities have got areas outside of the AOB, and I'm talking to local authorities who do not want to be part of what we are because they can't see how it's relevant for them and the majority of their residents. And I think if we really asked ourselves that question, are we relevant to the majority of people in the UK who live in urban areas like Luton and Reading? Probably the answer is no. We've got to find a way to mean something to all those people. And I don't mean direct access, that's a different challenge, but we've got to be relevant somehow. And I think our local authorities all have to hear the narrative of why we exist, what's so special, why we benefit them, why we benefit everybody. And that's
Thank you. Thanks, Sue. I'm going to go to James next, then Peter, and then Martin. That's right. So,
this is not rehearsed, so Peter and I might not always agree, but what I'm actually about to say basically is I actually think we are valued very much by the county council in my case, and I think our district.
Sorry, yours was
Suffolk.
Suffolk, yep.
Suffolk County Council, the county in the whole England. And what I would say is that why do they value them? They value them because we have, in a relatively small way, we're one of the smallest AOBs, we have a very astute team on how to harness volunteers and actually the use of that volunteer labour in delivering some very relatively small projects that can actually be recognised by the locality. I think one of the areas that I would like to add to that comment while I'm speaking is that it will be part of the review. I would like to suggest, I know it's difficult, I'd like to suggest that somebody reviews the total amount. We had the word silos used, I totally support it. Lots of silo piles of money coming down from various pots in government. And at the end of the day, it all comes from the same place. I mean, forget the accountants, it all comes from the same place. And as part of the review, it would be very interesting to know how much money is coming around and how much that efficiency of the use of that money could be made. Because as you say, I don't think it's going to be a significant any extra money. You've just got to try and end the review, find out how you can make that money get spent better, and you get better visibility of what we do with that money.
thank you, James. Peter, say who you are and where you're from, please.
Well, Peter Stevens, just down the road, but I represent an area of Suffolk that I hold very dear. And the people that I represent do have different views about landscape than a lot of us here. And I just wonder how we move that thought process that is growing in urban areas about vegetarianism and veganism. And if you follow that through to a natural conclusion, you never get another green field like that on the view. So you have to appreciate both sides of the argument. You mustn't let current trends overtake the thought process of protected landscapes. It's a fine balance. We had a presentation just now from a farmer that has to make his living on the land, but he would like to embrace, if he can afford it, all the ecosystems that we find dear, and we know through science probably that he only just understands. So you must appreciate that. Those of us that live out there that are not scientists and not graduates per se, to work and make us these plans happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. I'm going to go to Martin, then I'm going to come back, and then I'm at the back there. So, Martin.
Right, thanks. Martin Lane, Cotswolds Conservation Board. Sort of an observation and question. Within a sort of AOMB fora, naturally, we're going to talk from our own special landscapes, AOMBs in this particular instance. But I wonder to what degree we can take a step back from that and look at what's in the best interest of England's finest landscapes as a collective. And I'm struck by, in the 1980s, we didn't have AOMB conferences, we had Heritage Coast conferences. And the term Heritage Coast was much more to the fore than AOMBs. Now, you know, since in the 90s and largely through the Crow Act, we've then seen AOMBs take on a much more significant scale, resourcing and such like. But I suppose that sort of re-emphasises how things might change over time and to what degree we can collectively actually say
this might be in the best interest of England's protected landscape. We don't get a review every other year, every 10 years, etc., etc. This one's been in the waiting for 69 or 70 years. And how we can make the best of it for not only the next generation, but the next 5 generations or what have you. So I suppose it's a plea that, to some extent, yes, we argue from the best interests of our patches or the collective of A&Bs, but to what degree we can also remove those local hats and put on a hat which looks at England and says, this is what we should be arguing.
Okay. Can I
just very briefly on that? It's clearly a good point. One possible route that some of that may be achieved is through the change in farming policy, which isn't site-specific, but could be linked to designated landscapes of a multitude of different kinds, and focusing on sort of ways of localising or spending money differently. I'm not saying that's certain, but I do think that's, if you look ahead for the next 4 or 5 years, what's one big thing that affects landscape that's going to change? That is it.
Thanks, Martin. If I could come back to the front here, I'll come back to the back later. So, yes, please.
Thank you. Sylvia Tidy, Chairman of the High Wheel Joint Advisory Committee. I think I'm very lucky that I have an absolutely magnificent team, and I think we have been discussing this, and where I think we're trying to sort of see where we go is looking at what we can do in the future, how best a designation suits us. Does it suit us to be an AONB, or does it actually suit us to be half an AONB, half a national park? Should we be a national park? How do we fit into that scene in the best way without actually putting huge amount more of work on us, because we don't want to become a big national park authority. We might like a few more people. And so I think that's where we're going, because other organisations within the High Weald have written to us and say, oh, go for a national park. They think that that will stop development and stop everything else. But I think for us it is how we best conserve the future, where that is going to come from, how we can impart ourselves and put that knowledge into the review. And it's very important. And I think as far as local authorities are concerned, and listening to the earlier from Kirsten about health and well-being and such like, local authorities are strapped for cash. If we can help improve the mental health of this country by doing something through our areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks, we will be doing this country a huge service. And so I feel quite strongly about trying to get us more linked in to the wider world of the health side through health and wellbeing boards and local authorities.
Thank you, Sylvia. If I can just come back briefly on that, because of the work we're doing in Wales with the A1Bs and the national parks over parity. So the Minister has been very clear, she wants to break down the disparity between the two. And wherever we've drilled deep into this, it has not been a parity of form that is actually going to solve the problem. It was a parity of function. And sometimes that function determines a different form, but more often than not it didn't. So actually the response there may be more complicated, but I think we need to look into it. Thank you for that. I'm going to go to the back. It's behind. I'll come down to, not you, behind you first, and then I'll come back.
Me?
Yes, please. Sorry, I don't know your name. So.
Of course not. My name is Fleur de Réfili. I'm a member of Wiltshire Council, and I've been involved in the Cranbourne Chase and the North Wessex Downs since their inception. Wiltshire Council hosts both. And, I've got 2 points. One, I think one of the concerns I've got, if there are to be extra involvement and extra powers, is democratic accountability, which is particularly with where planning laws that come involved, is an issue for local authorities. And the other is the protection of the areas immediately adjacent. 40% of Wiltshire, over 40% of Wiltshire, is designated ANOB or national park. And in the middle of it, you've got Salisbury Plain, which you can't touch either. So the bits in between, in which I happen to be, are a threat because of the protections for the protected landscape. And the very last point is I do think the ANOB should be able to promote tourism. The national parks can, the ANOBs very often do, but it isn't in their remit, and I think it's a good idea.
Okay, thank you. It's a very clear message there. I've got Chris at the back, and then I'm coming back to you. Yes, that way. So, Chris?
We slightly moved into where I'm going here, which is there's been quite a bit of talk about purposes when the review's been discussed, and yes, we can and largely do promote sort of enjoyment and understanding of the countryside and access to the countryside. If we're going to get some additional purposes, we need to be pretty careful about what they are and don't try and grab everything like kids in the sweet shop just because it's all there. If we are going to have to deliver additional purposes, I hate to come back to the resource thing, I don't know what other people think, but I'm sure if we're going to have to deliver on a range of other purposes, we are going to have to be resourced to deliver on those purposes, because we're currently actually delivering on them without them being formal purposes on an absolute shoestring. But one of the other things that might potentially be a purpose in some kind, and I think is really important and has often been overlooked in the whole review, is the plight of biodiversity in our AONBs and our national parks, because I really think that, and coming from the North Pennines, it surprised me saying this, but actually in the uplands especially, I think we're in danger of having some really very attractive landscapes that are becoming more and more devoid of wildlife. And we are in, every generation has a baseline that it thinks is where our wildlife's at. And there's this shifting baseline syndrome where actually we're losing such a phenomenal amount of wildlife in our countryside. We absolutely have to do something about it now. And our protected landscapes have the capacity, with the teams and the skills that they have, the partnerships they have, the power to bring people together, the relationships they have with the farming community, and the potential to deliver new agro-environment schemes through the teams in those places. There is an opportunity that we need to grasp now to turn around the fortunes in our biodiversity, because we might not get enough.
Thank you.
I just pick up on
go
see if it works. Yeah, it works now. There's two excellent points there. One on the sort of borders of protected landscapes and the rest of the country. I think that's a very strong point. I don't really know quite how to solve it, but you see it next to national parks. I see it in Derbyshire. There's a village called Brailsford, not far from us, and a very nice landscape. It's getting an awful lot of houses because Derbyshire Dales has got to put them somewhere, and Matlock is growing too. Not necessarily bad for Matlock to grow, but it puts pressure on people who are not in those landscapes. And on biodiversity, exactly right. And it's quite striking in conversations I've had in big meetings. It's been interesting to wait how long before biodiversity comes up. And it's quite striking, it takes quite a while. Often, understandably, people want to talk about powers and about resources. I completely understand why I would too. But out there, one of the things the public are beginning to worry about, and certainly the sort of national environmental debate is worrying about and getting a lot of traction with, is what, for want of a different word, we can call biodiversity, how natural are the natural places. That's not the same as wilding, another controversial debate, but it's undoubtedly true. I've seen it in Derbyshire. You can read it if you read Mark Cocker's excellent new book, and I've talked to him, and it can be reversed. We can do things better than we do now, and I think designated landscapes can play a big role in doing that. I know lots of people will have examples of how you're already doing that. Sometimes it's about telling the story, and it goes back again to one of the themes of the conversation so far, which is joining things up. Lots of good things happening, lots of pots of money, often not big enough, lots of different ambitions and instincts, putting them together to tell a bigger story, to try and share experiences and do things in a more connected way. For landscape, which is a connected thing, does often work better. Easy to say and harder to do.
Thank you. On the basis...
Sorry, can I start with one thing, because it's important about that one, and it's a relation of Sue's point to Chris's point, is not about losing sight about the intrinsic value of these landscape areas. Because if we only look at what's relevant to the generation that we live in now, then we could say, well, you know, Canterbury Cathedral has very little relevance 20 years ago, so we should have knocked it down. It's got significant relevance now because it's got a new purpose. All of these things, and biodiversity is one. We need to have relevance in some way, but if these are England's national treasures, that should be a bottom line that is immovable, and their purpose and their reason might change over time, but the baseline of why they're important doesn't change.
Thank you, Paul. With my commitment to get Julian into his taxi by 5, I'm going to give David, David will have the last question, I have to say, and then we'll swap over and encourage the other groups to do likewise by getting out of here. So David, over to you.
I'm David Wright, Chairman of the Surrey Hills AONB Board. On the question of public recognition and engagement, I think we, after sterling efforts, have concluded that the term AOB is really a handicap that we can do without, and it doesn't really matter much what we're called, but it's got to be instantly recognisable by the public who are half interested, and if we want to get them full interested, it needs to be made easier. Second point, I think, is that certain AOBs suffer more from pressure of visitors than others. We are literally swamped, particularly at weekends, and it seems to me that if funding is going to be put into the countryside, it ought to be related to usage by the public. That needs to be measured, and that measure should be an indication of funding and how much there should be. And in relation to...
Not sure everybody here would agree. Just get a slight sense.
Or the biodiversity value.
But I understand there's no formal way of measuring it, and I think there really should be. Someone ought to put their thinking caps on. As far as project finance is concerned, we have none whatsoever. And now the HLF are pretty much dried up. We cannot do anything except through local funding of one form or another in income generation. And I think I'd say to you that because we are so lean and hungry, we probably do represent good value for money. I mean, we have one full-time chief officer and 3 part-time people, and that's it. That's all we've got to operate. So we do get a lot of local engagement as a result, and it's needs must that you have to do it. And probably it forces us to do things that if we were more comfortably funded wouldn't happen. The last thing I'm going to say was about our relationship with local councils. In our experience, our local councils are very supportive and protective of the AOB. That actually isn't a problem. We've had a recent problem with a local inspector who's come along and insisted that despite the local plan wished to protect the AOB, that houses should be built in it, and that is now subject to judicial review. But I think ministers ought to understand that there are influences working in the centre of government that are undermining the AOB, and one shouldn't sweep that under the table. As far as relationships with what is the word? Those authorities that act as our hosts, that is just a matter of local politics, and it's one of the biggest bugbears that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's see if we make it work again. Yes, I'm sure in Surrey you probably don't find it too hard to get access sometimes to the ministers, but it's been brilliant to talk. We could keep talking all afternoon. I should say I did come by bus. We are getting a taxi back, but I did try to use public transport. The areas of conversation are fascinating. I mean, resources keeps coming up, and it's a fair point. We saw it in Cornwall. You can see it again and again. You can't kind of go down much further and continue to do anything. How do you change that? How we change that together? It's a challenge. I can't promise an easy answer. I think biodiversity is a really strong point. I think the role of public visitor engagement and promotion of visiting and taking part in landscapes is really valid. How the boundaries of parks work and AOBs, again, challenges there. The name, I think, it matters, and I would like to hear suggestions. You say it doesn't matter what they're called as long as it's not the current one. I think you can do better than that, but I don't have an answer yet, but perhaps put them in. I look forward to lots more conversations, certainly to taking part in the call for evidence. We will certainly keep in touch, and I hope we can help. So thank you for your time. I'm sorry we don't have longer. I think we're moving on to part 2.
We are moving on.
So it'll be interesting to see if we hear the same sort of questions.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So thank you. Well done.